The morning Abel Walden finally understood what he had been losing was the morning the wind stopped blowing across his land and left behind a silence so complete it felt like an accusation. He stood on the porch of his farmhouse, boot heels planted on the warped wood planks, coffee going cold in his hand, and he listened to that silence stretch out in every direction like a held breath. The cattle were penned. The horses were fed. The fields were as ordered as a man with calloused hands and a stubborn jaw could make them. Everything was exactly as it should have been, and yet the quiet sat in his chest like a stone he could not name. It was the autumn of 1883, and Abel Walden was 29 years old, and he was alone on 400 acres of good Kansas grassland that he had worked since he was 17 and inherited outright at 22, when his father coughed his last breath into a handkerchief stained dark with what the doctor called consumption. The land was his. The land had always been his. And for years he had told himself, in the particular way a man tells himself things that require no examination, that the land would always be enough. He had been wrong. He just had not known it yet. The town of Harrow's Bend was 11 miles east on a road that turned to soup when it rained and cracked like old pottery when it dried. It was not a large town, but it had what a person needed. A general store run by a man named Hoskins who charged fair prices and extended credit to those who worked honest. A saloon called the Copper Kettle that smelled of sawdust and whiskey and the kind of trouble that mostly sorted itself out by morning. A church with a leaning steeple. A telegraph office. A post office, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Greeley who kept geraniums in her windows and a rifle under her front counter. It was at the post office that Abel first heard about Pearl Chandler. He had driven the wagon into town on a Tuesday in early October, the sky above the plains the particular shade of blue that only existed in autumn, sharp and clear as cut glass. He had come to collect a crate of fence wire and to post a letter to a cousin in Missouri who owed him $12. While he was waiting at the counter, the postmaster, an angular man named Duval, was carrying on a conversation with Mrs. Greeley about a woman who had recently arrived at the boarding house. Came in on the Thursday stage, Duval was saying, sorting envelopes with practiced efficiency. All by herself. No husband, no brother, no escort of any kind, just her and a trunk and a carpet bag. She has good manners, Mrs. Greeley said, with the particular tone women used when they meant to defend someone before any attack had been launched. She is quiet and she pays prompt and she does not leave the washroom in disorder. I'm not saying anything against her, Duval said, though his voice suggested he might have been about to. Only that it is unusual. A woman alone. Women alone are more common than men like to admit, Mrs. Greeley said firmly. The world makes us that way often enough. Abel had not intended to listen. He was not by nature a man who listened to other people's business when he had his own business to attend to. But something about the conversation snagged his attention in the way a loose nail catches a shirt sleeve, and he found himself paying attention in spite of himself. "Where is she from?" he asked, more to fill the silence of Duval's pause than because he expected any answer to matter to him. Duval looked at him. "Ohio. Some place called Milford. Lost her father last spring from what I understand. Had a brother but he went west 2 years ago and nobody has heard from him since. She's come to take a position." "What position?" "Schoolteacher." The county advertised for one back in June. Miss Chandler answered the advertisement. Mrs. Greeley made a sound of approval. "She is educated. You can tell by the way she speaks. Careful with her words but not stiff about it." Abel collected his mail, signed for his fence wire, and drove home. He did not think about Pearl Chandler again for the remainder of that day. He pulled fence wire in the afternoon, mended a gate hinge before supper, ate beans and salt pork alone at a table that seated 6, and went to bed in a house that was quiet in the same way the prairie was quiet after a storm, when everything is still but not yet settled. He thought about her on Wednesday, though, and Thursday. He saw her for the first time on a Friday, outside the general store. She was standing at the edge of the board sidewalk, holding a paper bag of provisions against her chest with both arms, looking down the main street of Harrow's Bend with an expression that was not quite uncertainty and not quite courage, but something that lived between them, like a person standing at the edge of a river, deciding whether the current is manageable. She was wearing a dark blue dress, practical and well-kept, and her hair, which was the color of dark honey, was pinned up in the way women wore it in 1883. But a few strands had escaped, and the October breeze was doing what breezes do. She was not tall, but she held herself straight, and Abel thought, with the kind of clarity that comes unexpectedly, that she looked like someone who had made difficult decisions before and had not broken under them. He had not meant to stop. He was there to buy salt and nails and a small bottle of liniment for a horse with a sore fetlock. But he stopped, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he took his hat off because that was what his mother had taught him to do in the presence of a woman, and she nodded once, the way a person nods when they have decided another person is probably not a threat. "You are new to Harrow's Bend," he said. It was not his most elegant contribution to conversation. "I arrived last week," she said. Her voice was steady and even, with just the faintest trace of something that was not quite shyness but was adjacent to it. "I am the new schoolteacher." "Abel Walden," he said, and put his hand out. She shifted the paper bag to one arm and shook it. Her grip was firmer than he expected. "Pearl Chandler. Welcome to Harrow's Bend, Miss Chandler. It is not the prettiest town in Kansas, but it has good bones." She looked at the street again, taking it in with those measuring eyes, and then she looked back at him. "That is a fair thing to say about a place, or a person." He did not know what to do with that. He put his hat back on and said, "If you need anything, directions or the like, most people around here are willing enough to help." "Thank you," she said. "I will remember that." He went into the general store and bought his salt and his nails and his liniment, and when he came back out she was gone, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than he needed to before walking back to his wagon. He drove home thinking about what she had said. That is a fair thing to say about a place, or a person. He had good bones, he knew that. He also knew that good bones alone were not the same as a warm house. Pearl Chandler began teaching at the Harrow's Bend schoolhouse on the second Monday of October, 1883. She taught reading, arithmetic, geography, and penmanship to 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, in a single room with a wood-burning stove and windows that let in good light in the morning and too much cold in the afternoon. The school board had given her a curriculum guide and a primer and a blackboard and 47 pieces of chalk, and had told her she was expected to maintain order and make progress, and not ask for more than what was already allocated. Pearl Chandler had nodded at all of this and then had gone ahead and done things her own way, which was the way of a woman who had been educated at a female seminary in Columbus, and who believed, with a quiet conviction that she never felt the need to loudly announce, that children learned best when they were curious rather than afraid. Within 2 weeks, the children of Harrow's Bend were curious. Abel heard this from Hoskins at the general store, who had a daughter named Clara in Pearl's classroom. Hoskins said, with a kind of bemused admiration, that Clara had come home talking about the Mississippi River and its tributaries, and had drawn a map on the back of an old flour sack. "She never showed that kind of interest before," Hoskins said. "Whatever that teacher is doing, she is doing it right." Abel bought more than he needed at the store that day, or so he told himself later, trying to understand why he had lingered so long when he had fences to check. His first real conversation with Pearl Chandler happened at the church social in mid-October. These socials were a fixture of life in Harrow's Bend, held on the third Saturday of each month, organized by the minister's wife, a capable woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who treated the social as a military campaign conducted with casseroles and sheet cakes. The whole of the town showed up, because in a community of this size and in this era, the social was not optional in any practical sense. You went, or you became the subject of concerned inquiry that would follow you for weeks. Abel went. He always went, the same way he always went to church, because his mother had raised him to, and because the habit had calcified into something that was now simply part of who he was, indistinguishable from the way he drank his coffee without sugar or wore his hat pushed back rather than pulled forward. Pearl was there, standing near the edge of things in the way of a person who is comfortable enough but still learning the architecture of a new place. She was speaking to Mrs. Greeley, nodding at something the older woman was saying, and she was holding a cup of punch that she had barely touched. Abel was not a man who made approaches easily. He was a man of the land, and the land did not require him to be charming or clever. It required him to be steady and patient and willing to do hard work without complaint, and these were qualities that served him very well in his fields and somewhat less well in parlors and social halls. But he walked toward her anyway, because the quiet in his house had been following him around all week like a dog that would not be dismissed, and he was tired of arguing with it. "Miss Chandler," he said, "are you settling in?" She turned and looked at him with those evaluating eyes, and then she smiled, which was the first time he had seen her do it, and it changed her face in a way that was not dramatic but was significant, the way a lamp lit in a window changes the whole look of a house from outside. "Mr. Walden, yes, I believe I am. Slowly. Slowly is the right way to settle in," he said. "You learn more that way. Do you speak from experience? I grew up 11 miles from here. I have been settling into this country my whole life." She looked out through one of the windows at the dark prairie beyond the glass. "It is a very different country than what I am accustomed to. Ohio has trees, it has hills, everything here is so." She searched for the word, "open." "Some people find that frightening," he said. "I find it clarifying," she said, which was not what he expected, and he found himself looking at her with more attention because of it. "There is nothing to hide behind, you see everything as it actually is." "That can be uncomfortable," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but I think I prefer discomfort to illusion." He thought about that for a long moment. Then he said, "There is a view from the ridge on my property, about a mile north of the house. When the light is right in the evening, the grass turns gold and you can see 30 miles in every direction. I have never seen anything in Ohio, but I suspect it might give the trees a fair competition." She looked at him steadily. "That is almost an invitation, Mr. Walden." "Almost," he agreed. She smiled again, smaller this time, like she was keeping it for herself. "Good evening," she said, and drifted away to speak with Mrs. Aldrich about the school's need for additional primers. Abel stood where he was for a moment, holding his own cup of punch, and realized his face felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove across the room. He asked her officially, 3 days later, stopping his wagon outside the schoolhouse at the end of the school day when the children had scattered homeward, and she was shaking chalk dust from the felt eraser against the outside wall of the building. He asked her if she would like to ride out and see the view from the ridge on Sunday afternoon, after church, if the weather held. He said it plainly and without elaboration, the way he would have stated any practical fact, because that was how Abel Walden communicated when he was uncertain of himself and didn't want it to show. Pearl looked at him, the eraser in her hand, chalk dust drifting between them in the afternoon light. She said, "Yes, Mr. Walden, I would like that." The weather held. Sunday was the kind of October day that Kansas occasionally offered as apology for its more brutal demonstrations of climate. The sky was enormous, and the air was crisp enough to be bracingly cold but not brutal, and the cottonwood trees along the creek that crossed the western edge of Abel's property had gone yellow, their leaves shivering and catching the light like scattered coins. Pearl wore a heavier coat than she had been wearing before, dark wool, and a hat with a practical brim, and she sat in Abel's wagon with her hands folded in her lap and asked him questions about the land as they drove. She asked good questions. Not the polite, surface-level questions people asked when they were filling silence, but real questions, the kind that showed she had been paying attention. She asked what the grass was called. She asked how many head of cattle he ran. She asked about the rainfall in summer and what happened to the creek in drought years, and whether the land had belonged to anyone before his family. That last question made him go quiet for a moment. The Osage people used this land long before any settler touched it, he said. They were removed by treaty and by force, both. My father bought the deed from a land company in 1864. I grew up knowing that history, even if it was not comfortable to know it. Pearl nodded slowly. That is an honest answer. It is the only kind I know how to give. She looked at him. That is rarer than you might think. They reached the ridge and he helped her down from the wagon, and they stood at the edge of the higher ground where the land fell away in long, sweeping rolls of golden grass, and the light of the late afternoon came in low and amber from the west and turned everything it touched into something that looked less like Kansas and more like some painter's imagined paradise. The sky above was deep blue shading to violet at the horizon, and a hawk turned lazy circles in the updrafts below the ridge, and the whole world smelled of dry grass and cold air and something clean that didn't have a name. Pearl stood with her arms at her sides and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Well," he said eventually. "You were right," she said quietly. "The trees would lose." He stood beside her and the wind moved between them, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had been standing on this ridge for 20 years, and it had never looked quite the same as it did right now. Something about the way she was seeing it made him see it differently. As if her eyes were a lens that focused things he had let go blurry from familiarity. "I used to come up here when I was a boy," he said. "When things were hard mostly. My father was not an easy man to live with. The land was always simpler than people." "Is that still true?" she asked. She was not looking at him, still looking at the view, and her voice was even and quiet, but the question was pointed in that careful way she had. He thought about it honestly. "I used to think so," he said. "Lately I am less certain." She turned and looked at him then, and her eyes were the color of deep water in good light, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away for a moment that lasted longer than either of them later admitted to themselves. "Tell me about Ohio," he said, because he needed to say something, and that was what came. She told him. She told him about her father, who had been a professor of natural history at a small college and who had died of a fever in May, leaving her with a small inheritance, a house that needed to be sold to cover debts, and a brother who had gone west seeking coppermine work in Montana and had stopped writing home 8 months before. She spoke about her father with a love that was clear and clean and already accustomed to grief, the way you speak about someone you have had time to begin to accept losing. She did not speak about her brother without a shadow moving across her face, a worry she was carrying that she did not dramatize but that was plainly heavy. "Have you tried to reach him?" Abel asked. "Your brother?" "I have sent letters to the last address I had for him, a mining camp near Helena. None have been answered. The telegraph office in Helena sent back word that the camp had closed. I do not know where he went from there." "That is a hard thing to carry," he said. "It is," she said simply. "But I am still carrying it." He nodded. He respected that more than he knew how to say. They drove back to town as the sun went down and the prairie turned purple-gray, and he helped her down from the wagon outside the boarding house, and she thanked him with a directness that was characteristic of her. No coy deflections, just honest appreciation, and he rode home with the last of the light and unhitched the horse in the dark, and stood in his house afterward, and realized he was still thinking about the way she had looked at that view, like it was something she had been waiting to see. He went back to town the following Friday. He told himself he needed to speak to Hoskins about an order of grain. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. He contrived to pass by the schoolhouse at the end of the school day. Pearl was at the door, watching the children scatter toward home, and she saw him coming, and something in her expression that he could not fully interpret but that was not unwelcoming shifted into place. He stopped the wagon and tipped his hat, and she said, "You are in town on a Friday now, Mr. Walden." "Grain order," he said. She said, in the tone of someone who believes what they are being told because they have decided to. "Will you walk with me to the post office? I have a letter to post." He looped his horse's reins to the hitching post and walked with her. The afternoon was cold now, properly cold, late October cold, and their breath made small clouds between them as they walked. She told him about a lesson she had taught that day involving a map of the United States and a disagreement between two of her older students about whether the nation's westward expansion had been good or bad for the country as a whole. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "I told them that it depended entirely on who you asked," she said, "and that a true education required them to ask more than one kind of person. The school board would not love that answer." "The school board is not in my classroom," she said, without heat, just matter of fact. He laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, the laugh of a man who does not laugh often and was caught off guard by his own amusement, and she glanced at him when she heard it, and her mouth curved up at the corner in the way that was becoming familiar to him, the almost private smile she gave when something pleased her that she hadn't entirely expected. They went to the post office, and she posted her letter, another attempt to locate her brother through a forwarding address she had found in an old letter of his, written before the camp near Helena closed. Then they walked back along the main street, and he bought her a cup of coffee at the small eating establishment beside the copper kettle that Mrs. Flores ran, a warm and well-smelling place with 4 tables and a wood stove and good coffee and excellent corn cake, and they sat across from each other and talked for an hour and a half about books, about Kansas weather, about the qualities required to survive loneliness, about what it meant to love a place. "Do you love it?" she asked. "Your land?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "but lately I have been trying to understand what kind of love it is." She waited. "I think I have loved it the way you love something when you don't have to think about whether it is enough," he said. "It was just always there. It never asked anything of me that I wasn't willing to give. The cattle needed feed and the fences needed keeping and the fields needed turning. It was all very clear. And now," he turned his coffee cup in his hands, "now I sit in my house in the evening after the work is done and the quiet is different than it used to be." She was very still across the table. "How so?" "It used to be peaceful," he said. "Now it is just quiet. There is a difference." She looked at him for a long moment, and he had the feeling, not for the first time, that she was hearing more than the words he had spoken, that she was reading some secondary message he had not quite intended to send but had sent anyway. "Yes," she said finally, "there is." He drove home in the dark that night, and the stars were out in full force the way they were in October on the plains, burning and numerous, and he sat on his porch for a while after he came in despite the cold, and he looked at the sky and he admitted to himself, quietly and without fanfare, that he was in considerable trouble. November came, and with it the serious cold, the kind that settled into the land and stayed, and the social patterns of Harrow's Bend adjusted accordingly. People spent more time indoors. The church socials moved earlier in the evening. The general store became a place where people lingered longer over their purchases because stepping back outside was a commitment you needed to be resolved about. Abel found more reasons to be in town. He was not deceiving anyone, including himself, about why. He brought Pearl books he thought she might like, 2 novels he had kept on his shelf since his mother's time, and a copy of a scientific journal about prairie ecology that he thought, given what her father had done, she might find interesting. She received the books with genuine pleasure, running her hands over the covers in the way of a person who takes books seriously, which he found, unaccountably, very moving. She baked him a loaf of bread in return, using the boarding-house kitchen with Mrs. Greeley's permission, and left it wrapped in a clean cloth at the general store for him to collect on his next town day. He ate it that evening with butter and felt unreasonably glad about it. They took to meeting on Friday afternoons at Mrs. Flores's eating establishment as a regular arrangement. It was not formally declared as such. It simply became true through repetition. He would arrive in town on Friday for practical purposes, and at 4 o'clock, when the school let out, He would be at Mrs. Flores's with 2 cups of coffee already ordered, and Pearl would come in still carrying chalk dust on her cuffs sometimes, and she would sit down and they would talk for as long as the light lasted. He learned her in pieces, the way you learn a land, slowly and by paying attention over time. He learned that she was 25 and had been teaching since she was 20, first at a small school in Milford, then at a larger school in Columbus, and that she had always wanted to go somewhere wilder and more necessary, where the need for a teacher was real and urgent rather than administrative. He learned that she had a habit, when she was thinking hard, of tilting her head slightly to the left. He learned that she drank her coffee strong and without milk, and that she had read more books than he could name in a conversation, and that she was capable of sitting in comfortable silence in a way that very few people he had ever known were capable of. He learned that she was funny in the dry, understated way that sometimes made her the only person laughing at something and not even slightly bothered by it. He learned that she was afraid some mornings, when the scale of the prairie made Ohio feel impossibly far away. She told him this one Friday in late November, matter-of-factly, as she held her coffee cup in both hands for warmth. There are mornings when I wake up and the sky is gray and the wind is blowing and I cannot hear a single sound from a human being in any direction, and for a moment I think I have made a catastrophic error. And then, he asked, and then the children arrive, she said. And one of them says something completely extraordinary for 7 in the morning, and I think, no, this is exactly where I should be. He looked at her across the table. What do you do on the mornings when it is a Saturday? He asked. She smiled. That full one, not the almost private one. I write very long letters, she said. And I read. And I remind myself that a person can be afraid and write at the same time. He thought about that for the rest of the day. A person can be afraid and write at the same time. The letter came in December. He was with her at the post office, not by design but because he had happened to arrive in town on the same afternoon she was there collecting her mail, and the postmaster Duval handed her a letter with a Helena, Montana postmark, and she went very still when she saw it. Her hands, Abel noticed, were not entirely steady when she opened it. He waited. He did not offer to give her privacy because she had not asked for it, and he had a sense that what she needed was not space but presence. She read it. Her face went through several things in quick succession, relief and sorrow and something more complicated, and then she folded the letter carefully and pressed it flat against her palm and said, "My brother is alive." "Thank God," Abel said. "He has been ill, typhoid in the winter of last year. He was in a hospital in Butte for 3 months and he lost everything, his wages, his tools, his address book. He has been working in a silver mine since spring, trying to recover his footing. He says he is sorry for the silence. He says he did not write because he was ashamed." Her voice was very steady but her eyes were bright, and Abel did what he had not done before, not in all these weeks of carefully maintained friendly proximity. He reached across the counter and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just long enough to mean what he intended it to mean, which was that he understood, and that she was not alone in this small room in this frontier post office. She looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and something shifted between them that had been building for weeks, like pressure underground that finds its crack and moves. "Thank you," she said. He took his hand back. They walked out of the post office into the cold December air, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then she said, "Abel," using his given name for the first time, and he turned to look at her, and she said, "I am very glad I came to Kansas." He looked at her in the gray December light, at her honest face and her careful eyes, at the woman who had arrived alone and not collapsed under the weight of alone, and he said, "I am very glad you came to Kansas too, Miss Chandler." "Pearl," she said. "Pearl," he said. The first snow came the following week, a proper plain snowfall that came in overnight and turned the world white and made the roads uncertain. Abel did not go to town that Friday. He sent a note with a neighboring rancher, a man named Garrett, who passed the road into Harrow's Bend on his regular supply run, and the note said simply, "Roads are poor. Will come when they clear. I hope the schoolhouse stove is functioning. AW, she sent a note back, delivered by Garrett on his return. It said, "The stove is working perfectly. The children are delighted by the snow." I tried to explain to them the meteorological mechanisms involved, and they ignored me completely in favor of throwing snowballs. I believe I have lost this particular battle. The views from the schoolhouse windows are remarkable. I've been thinking about what you said about the quiet and the peace and the difference between them. I think I understand it better now than I did. Be careful on the roads. PC. He read that note 3 times and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, which was where he carried things that mattered. Christmas in Harrow's Bend was a community affair. The church put up a tree. Mrs. Aldrich organized a program of carols. The school children performed a recitation. Families came from as far as 20 miles for the celebration, because in 1883 on the Kansas plains, the distances that counted for isolation in summer became navigable by determination in winter when there was a reason worth the cold. Abel came, naturally. He brought a ham from his smokehouse for the community supper, and he sat through the carol program with the patience of a man who is not particularly musical but who understands the purpose of music in a community. When Pearl's students performed their recitation, she stood at the side of the room watching them with an expression of such concentrated attention and quiet pride that he could not stop looking at it. She was not watching for errors. She was watching for their moments of confidence, the way a person who has been pulling someone up a hill watches when they take their first steps without help. After the program, in the social hour that followed with the kind of food that only community effort can produce, he found her by the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, a cup of cider in her hand. "They were wonderful," he said. "They were," she agreed, and the pride in her voice was unguarded in a way she usually wasn't. Thomas Haymaker, the red-headed boy in the back row, could not get through his section without stopping 2 weeks ago. He has a stutter that comes and goes with his nervousness. Tonight he said every word. "What did you do?" "I told him that the words would wait for him," she said, "that they were not going anywhere, that the audience could wait too, and if they couldn't, that was their problem and not his." He looked at her. "You are a remarkable teacher, Pearl." The name still felt new in his mouth, not uncomfortable but significant, the way any real thing feels when you first allow yourself to call it by its true name. She turned from the window and looked at him. The room was warm with fire and candlelight and the heat of many people gathered, and in that light she looked like something from a story, not a fairy tale story, not anything delicate or improbable, but the kind of story that is true and therefore more beautiful than invention. "Abel," she said. "Yes. Would you like to come to supper at the boarding house next Sunday? Mrs. Greeley has invited me to host a small meal in her dining room, and she has said I may invite one guest of my choosing." He held her gaze. "Is that what you would like?" "Yes," she said. "Then I will be there," he said. Sunday supper at the boarding house was the first time Abel had sat down to a meal with Pearl that was not at Mrs. Flores's coffee establishment, and the difference was significant in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. There was a tablecloth. There were candles. Mrs. Greeley had made herself diplomatically scarce after setting out the food, appearing only to refill the water pitcher, and then retreating with the air of a woman who is very interested in the goings-on of the hallway. The food was roasted chicken and winter vegetables and bread that Pearl had made herself, and it was better than anything Abel had eaten in the 2 years since his last hand. A young man named Birch had moved on to Wyoming. They talked through the entire meal and after, sitting at the cleared table with the candles burning low, and the conversation had the quality of conversations that happen when two people have stopped being careful about what they reveal and started being honest about who they are. He told her things about his father he had not told anyone, about the man's silences that could last weeks, and the way he had used work as armor against feeling, and the way Abel had both inherited that quality and spent years quietly fighting it. She told him about the years after her mother died when she was 14, how the house had changed, how her father had loved her fiercely but had never quite known what to do with a daughter who was not her mother, how she had learned to be more self-sufficient than was probably natural because no one had thought to tell her she didn't have to be. "We are both very practiced at being alone," he said. "Yes," she said. "And I am beginning to think that is not quite the same as being good at it." He looked across the table at her in the candlelight, and he thought about the ridge and the view and the silence in his house, and the note folded in his coat pocket and all the Friday afternoons, and he said, "Pearl, I need to say something." She was very still. "I have been telling myself for most of my adult life that the land is enough, that the work and the seasons and the good, honest rhythm of it is everything a person needs. And I believed it. I believed it so completely that I stopped looking at whether it was actually true." He paused. "And then you came to Harrow's Bend and I drove you out to the ridge and watched you look at my land and something happened that I have not been able to undo." She looked at him without moving. "I do not mean to be precipitous," he said. "I know we have known each other only a few months, but I am not a man who dissembles well, and I think you have noticed that, and I think you know what I am saying before I say it." "Tell me anyway," she said quietly. "I would like to hear you say it." "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I believe I have been for some time, and the land is still beautiful and I still love it, but it is not enough. It was never enough. I just did not understand that until I had something to compare it to." The silence after that was not the empty silence of his house in the evenings. It was full. It was a held breath over something real. "Abel," Pearl said. Her voice was lower than usual, careful in the way of someone handling something valuable. "I came to Kansas to be useful and to start again, and to be somewhere that needed what I had to give. I did not come expecting to feel what I have been feeling for the past 6 weeks. What have you been feeling?" She looked at him steadily, and he understood by now that when she went very still it was not withdrawal but concentration, the full weight of her attention gathering itself. "Like the prairie," she said. "Like when you stand on the ridge and everything is open and clear and there is nothing between you and the horizon." He understood her perfectly. "I think I love you too," she said. "I am not certain yet, but I think it is becoming certain." She paused. "That is the most honest answer I can give you." "It is exactly enough," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand palm up and laced her fingers through his. And they sat like that while the candles burned, and Mrs. Greeley made discreetly pleased sounds in the direction of the kitchen. The winter of 1883 moving into 1884 was not kind to the Kansas plains. A hard freeze in January took out a significant portion of Abel's winter wheat, and he spent 3 weeks in the brutal cold doing what could be done, which was mostly assessing damage and making decisions about what to replant. He had savings enough to carry him through a bad season, but the loss was real and the work was exhausting, and there were days when the cold was so deep and the sky so white and featureless that even a man who loved his land felt the weight of it pressing down. On those days he thought about Pearl, not in an escapist way, not the way you think about something that takes you away from difficulty, but in the way you think about someone who makes the difficulty make sense. She was 11 miles away teaching Thomas Haymaker that words would wait for him, and he was out in the frozen fields assessing frost-killed wheat, and somehow the fact of her existence in the world made the second thing more bearable. He drove to town when the roads allowed, which was twice in January and 3 times in February. Each time he came, she was ready to see him. Not waiting in any anxious or diminished way, she was a woman with too much self-possession for that, but present, alert, available in the way of someone who has decided you are worth being available for. In February, she let him hold her hand as they walked along the main street after Mrs. Flores's coffee, and nobody in Harrow's Bend pretended not to notice, though most of them were polite enough to confine their noticing to observations made in private. Mrs. Greeley told Mrs. Aldrich that it was about time Abel Walden had someone. Mrs. Aldrich agreed enthusiastically. Hoskins told his wife that the schoolteacher was a fine woman, and that Abel Walden had better not let her slip away, and his wife said that men always made these pronouncements as if it were the woman doing the slipping. Duval at the post office simply observed that both of them came in for their mail more regularly since October, which was not subtle but was accurate. In March, when the thaw came and the roads softened and the world began the slow, effortful work of coming back to color, Abel asked Pearl if she would like to come out to the farm and see it properly, not the ridge only, but all of it. He said it with some vulnerability he couldn't fully conceal, because asking her to see the actual mechanics and realities of his life felt different from asking her to admire a view. The view was what the land gave for free. The farm was what he was. She came on a warm Saturday in late March, the kind of day that felt like a promise after the winter. She wore her practical coat and her practical hat and a pair of boots that he noted with approval were properly made for walking rough ground, and he met her at the road and walked her through the property in sequence, the barn first, where the horses were, and she went up to them without hesitation and let them nose her hands, which told him something important. Then the cattle pasture, where the spring grass was beginning to come up, thin and bright green through the brown winter mat. Then the fields, where the winter wheat loss was visible, the pale dead stretches alternating with the sections he'd managed to salvage. He explained what had happened and what he was replanting and what the season ahead looked like, practically and financially, without softening it. She listened and asked questions, the good kind, the attentive kind, and she did not say anything consoling that would have felt empty. She just understood it. Then the house. He was nervous about the house in a way he had not expected to be. It was a good house, solidly built, 4 rooms, a real wood floor, a fireplace in the main room that drew well. But it was also a house that had not had a woman's attention in 7 years, since his mother had died, and the softness she had brought to it had slowly been absorbed by the practical gravity of a man living alone. It was clean, he had made sure of that, but it was spare. Pearl walked through it quietly, looking at everything with those eyes that missed nothing. She stopped at the bookshelves, which were substantial. She looked at the fireplace. She looked at the table with its 6 chairs, and she looked at Abel when she looked at the 6 chairs, and he felt himself understood in a way he was not entirely comfortable with but could not bring himself to avoid. "It is a good house," she said. "It is a quiet one," he said. She turned and looked at him directly, standing in the middle of his main room with the spring light coming through the window and dust motes moving in it. "Abel," she said. "Yes. Is this you asking me something?" He had not meant to do it this way, without preparation, without the right words arranged. But he was not a man who arranged words well under pressure, and she was standing in his house looking at him with complete clarity, and the quiet of the house was pressing in from all sides, familiar and accusatory, and no longer something he was willing to simply endure. "Yes," he said. "I believe it is." "Then ask me properly," she said, not coy, not playing, just honest. She wanted to hear the words. He said, "Pearl Chandler, I would like you to be my wife. I am asking you as plainly as I know how because you are a woman who deserves plain dealing, and I am a man who can only offer plain dealing. I love you. I know who you are, at least as much as a person can know another person in 6 months, and I think I will spend the rest of my life finding out more if you are willing." She was quiet for a long moment, standing in his house in the spring light. "I have things to think about," she said. "Not about whether I love you, I am certain about that now. But about the school and about what it means to be a wife in this time and this place, and whether the county will allow me to continue teaching after marriage, and about my brother, and about what kind of life this would be. Will you give me a week?" "I will give you as long as you need," he said. "A week," she said, "and then I will give you my answer." She came to the farm on the following Saturday, which was exactly 1 week. She came in a hired buckboard from town that she had driven herself, which, now that he thought about it, should have told him something about the kind of woman he was dealing with. She pulled up to the house and climbed down without waiting for help and walked up to where he was standing on the porch, and she said, "Yes, Abel. My answer is yes." He stepped off the porch and he kissed her for the first time, standing in the yard in the spring sunshine, and it was not the kind of kiss that is tentative or exploratory. It was the kind of kiss that confirms something already understood, a declaration made physical, and she kissed him back with her hands flat against his chest, and her eyes closed, and her whole posture leaning into it rather than away. When they separated, she said, "I have spoken to the school board chairman, and he has said that a married teacher is acceptable as long as she is willing to continue through the remainder of the school year, and if she is rehired for next fall it will be as usual. The county may not renew the contract if I have children, and that I will deal with when it comes." He looked at her. "You went and sorted the school board before you came to tell me yes." "I told you I had things to think about," she said, without apology. He laughed, the full surprised laugh, not the short one. He laughed until she started laughing too, and they stood in the yard in the April sunshine laughing, and a crow in the cottonwood by the creek took offense and flew away, and it was one of the finest moments of Abel Walden's life. They were married in June of 1884, in the Harrow's Bend church, on a morning when the prairie was in full summer color, and the air smelled of grass and heat and something new. Mrs. Aldrich had organized the flowers. The children from Pearl's classroom sat in a block at the left side of the church, and Thomas Haymaker, when his section of the program required him to read aloud a blessing he had been assigned, stood up and read it without stopping once, and Pearl watched him from the front of the church with her hand in Abel's and tears very close to the surface that she absolutely did not shed because she was Pearl Chandler and she did not shed tears in public. But her grip on Abel's hand tightened and he understood. Hoskins toasted them. Mrs. Greeley cried, openly and without embarrassment. Duval at the post office shook Abel's hand with the vigor of a man delivering a personal congratulation on behalf of the entire town. The minister read them through their vows in a good, steady voice, and Abel said his with the same plainness he brought to everything, direct and sure, and Pearl said hers with the same quiet conviction that he had come to understand was not quietness at all but a particular kind of strength. After the wedding, there was a supper in the church hall, and after the supper, Pearl drove home with Abel to the farm, sitting beside him in the wagon as the summer evening went gold around them, the same wagon they had first driven together to the ridge almost 8 months before. She sat close beside him, her shoulder against his arm, and she looked at the land as it rolled past, and he looked at her looking at the land, and the quiet between them was exactly the kind of quiet he had been unable to find for years. Not empty, full. "What are you thinking?" he asked her. "That the grass is beautiful in June," she said, "and that it is a very different thing to be riding toward a home than toward a boarding house." He put his arm around her, there on the wagon seat in the summer evening, and she leaned into his side, and the horses knew the way, and the stars were beginning to show one by one above the ridge to the east. Summer on the farm with Pearl was a revelation. He had known her in town, in the context of parlors and coffee establishments and church socials, which was a real context but not the whole picture. He did not fully understand who she was until he saw her in the daily architecture of the farm. She learned the farm the way she had learned everything else about Kansas, with genuine attention and without pretense about what she knew and didn't know. She admitted straightforwardly that she had not grown up on a farm and that she had things to learn, and then she learned them with a focused efficiency that he found simultaneously impressive and slightly overwhelming. Within 3 weeks she had mastered the kitchen garden, starting from a state of theoretical knowledge of vegetable cultivation, and arriving at a working grasp of the specific conditions of their soil and the particular patterns of sun and shade in that particular yard. She canned vegetables in August with a concentrated precision that reminded him of the way she had described her father, who had documented every species he found with taxonomic exactness. She kept teaching through the fall. The school board renewed her contract, as she had predicted, and she drove herself to town on school days in a small single-horse rig that Abel helped her select, a good steady mare named Ida who had a reliable temperament and an excellent sense of direction. Pearl drove her through rain and cold, and the occasional prairie wind that could make a person feel that the world was attempting to move them against their will. And she arrived at the schoolhouse every morning and she taught, and she was good at it. In the evenings she came home to Abel, and the evenings were the best part. They developed the habits of a shared life with a naturalness that surprised him, given that he had spent so many years in the fixed grooves of solitary routine. She sat across from him at the table, and they talked about the day, each one, hers full of children and their various illuminating difficulties and occasional small triumphs, his full of the concrete work of the land, the cattle and the fields and the equipment that needed tending. The table that had seated 6 in an accusatory way now seated 2 in the way that 2 is exactly the right number. He still went out to the porch at night sometimes, the old habit. But now she sometimes came with him, wrapping herself in a heavy shawl and standing beside him in the dark looking at the stars, and he did not stand looking at the sky feeling accused. He stood looking at the sky feeling, with a warm and uncomplicated gratitude like the luckiest man in Kansas. In September 1884, a letter arrived from Pearl's brother. His name was Thomas Chandler, and he was 22 years old, and he had been working a silver claim outside of Butte since the spring with a partner, and the claim had come in better than expected, not richly but honestly, enough to put him on stable ground. He was alive and well and deeply ashamed of his long silence, and he wanted very much to see his sister. He wrote that he had not known she had gone to Kansas until her most recent letter had finally reached him, and that he was astonished and proud of her in equal measure, and that if it was at all possible, he would like to come and visit before the winter made the mountain passes difficult. Pearl read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then set it down flat and put both hands over it as if she could feel the warmth of his handwriting through the paper. "He wants to come," she said. "Then he should come," Abel said. She looked up at him. "You would not mind, Pearl," he said. "He is your brother, of course he should come." Thomas Chandler arrived in Harrow's Bend on a Wednesday in late September, coming in on the stage from Wichita where he'd made a connection from Kansas City. He was a compact young man with Pearl's coloring, the same dark honey hair, the same evaluating eyes, and he had the look of someone who had worked hard in difficult conditions and had come through it not bitter but tempered, like metal that has been through fire and is stronger for it. He and Abel shook hands on the platform, and Thomas looked at him with the direct assessment of a man who loves his sister and has been away and is now conducting a rapid audit of the choices she made in his absence, and Abel looked back at him steadily because he had nothing to hide and no desire to perform. "She says you are a good man," Thomas said. "I try to be," Abel said. "She is an excellent judge," Thomas said. "So if she says you are, I believe it." He stayed 2 weeks. He slept in the spare room, which Pearl had made up with a thoroughness that involved actual curtains, the first curtains in that room in 7 years. He helped with the farm work in the mornings, showing more aptitude for it than Abel had expected from a mine worker, and Abel discovered that Thomas had grown up doing the same kind of farm labor on their Ohio property that Abel had grown up with on his own, so the work was familiar even if the scale was different. In the evenings, they sat at the table together, all 3 of them, and talked in the way of people who are building something together rather than simply occupying the same room. Thomas and Pearl had years of accumulated silence to fill, and they did it in overlapping waves, finishing each other's references, laughing at things that required no explanation because they came from the same shared history. Abel watched Pearl with her brother and understood, watching her, that there was a part of her that had been carrying a sustained and invisible tension for more than a year, and that with Thomas in the room that tension had finally, visibly, released. On his last evening, Thomas took Abel out to the porch while Pearl was finishing the supper dishes. He stood looking out at the land in the fall dark and he said, "I know I was not here when I should have been. When our father died, when she came out here alone, I know I left her to manage on her own. She managed very well," Abel said. "She always does," Thomas said. "That is not the same as it being fair." He paused. "You take care of her." "She takes care of herself," Abel said. and she takes care of me. That is how it works." Thomas looked at him, and something in his face relaxed in the way of someone who has been holding a worry and has found a place to set it down. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." Thomas went back to Montana in October. He wrote faithfully after that every 3 weeks, a habit he maintained with a reliability that Pearl found deeply moving, and that she sometimes read portions of aloud to Abel in the evenings. The funny parts, the stories of the mine and the mountains and the large, unfamiliar geography of his chosen life. In the spring of 1885, Pearl told Abel, on an April morning while he was pulling on his boots at the edge of the bed, that she was expecting. She told him plainly in the same direct way she told him everything, watching his face to see what he did with the information. What he did was sit very still for a moment, boot in hand, and then set the boot down and look at her. "Are you certain?" he said. "As certain as the almanac," she said. He put his hands on her face then, carefully, the way you handle something you cannot believe is real, and he kissed her forehead and then pulled her close and held her, there at the edge of the bed in the April morning with the light coming gray through the curtained window. And she held him back, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing to say that was larger than what they were already feeling. Their son was born in November of 1885 in the farmhouse, attended by Dr. Ingram, who had been practicing in Harrow's Bend for 12 years, and Mrs. Greeley, who had appointed herself without anyone asking her as the person who would be present for this event, and who was entirely correct in that appointment because she was exactly the person needed. Pearl labored through the day and into the evening with a gritted, focused determination that Abel, who was not permitted into the room but who spent the entire time on the other side of the door engaged in the particular torture of helpless waiting, would later describe as the bravest thing he had ever witnessed. And he had witnessed hard winters and hard summers, and the kind of difficulties that the land delivered without apology. The boy came into the world in the early hours of a November night, under a sky full of stars, announcing himself with a volume that Abel heard clearly through the closed door, and that made him sag against the wall of the hallway with relief so physical it felt like something he'd been physically carrying had been set down. Mrs. Greeley opened the door after a few minutes and looked at him with red eyes and a face that was attempting dignity and not entirely succeeding, and said, "A boy, Mr. Walden. A healthy, fine, loud boy, and your wife is well." He went in, and she was in the bed with the baby against her chest, looking tired down to the marrow of her bones, and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. And the baby was small and red and furious-looking in the way of new babies. And Abel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at both of them, and Pearl looked up at him with those clear eyes, dimmed a little by exhaustion but unbroken, and she said, "He has your jaw, I think." "God help him," Abel said, and she laughed, short and exhausted, and he took her hand. They named the boy William Henry Walden, William for Pearl's father, Henry for Abel's mother's side. He was known from very early as Will, because Pearl said the world would shorten it anyway, and they might as well choose the version they liked. He was a solid, serious baby who grew into a solid, curious toddler, and he had the unsettling habit, from the time he was old enough to walk beside his father in the yard, of asking questions about everything he saw with a persistence that Abel recognized as Pearl's quality expressed through a smaller person. Pearl went back to teaching in January, when Will was 2 months old. Mrs. Greeley took care of Will during school days, an arrangement that suited everyone involved, particularly Mrs. Greeley, who had entered into the role of honorary grandmother with a completeness that was total and unashamed. She knitted him things in improbable quantities and brought him on walks through Harrow's Bend in a small cart, introducing him to every person they passed with the proprietary pride of someone who considers herself significantly responsible for his existence. The school board renewed Pearl's contract for the 3rd year, then the 4th. She was becoming one of those figures in a community who are so thoroughly needed and so thoroughly excellent at what they do that the usual limitations that applied to married women in 1880s Kansas were simply not applied to her, not because the world had changed its views, but because the world, in the form of Harrow's Bend, had looked at Pearl Chandler Walden and decided that ideology was less important than competence. Abel watched his wife become indispensable to the town, the way a good tree becomes indispensable to a yard, not by asserting itself, but by simply being there and being what it is, season after season. He watched the children she taught year after year grow into young people who were curious and honest and capable, and he saw in this the continuation of something that had started when she stood on the sidewalk outside Hoskins's store in October 1883 with her paper bag of provisions and her careful eyes, deciding whether Kansas was something she could meet. The land changed over the years, as land does. There were good years and bad years. 1886 brought a drought that tested the farm and tested Abel's savings, and required difficult decisions about which cattle to sell and which fields to leave fallow. He made those decisions with Pearl present at the table, not just informed afterward, present in the making, because she was not a woman who wished to be managed around, and he was not a man who could bring himself to manage around her, and together they were better at the hard decisions than either of them was alone. Thomas came back from Montana in the spring of 1887, not for a visit but for good. The silver claim had played out, and he had money saved and a pair of willing hands and a desire to be closer to the only family he had left. Abel offered him a position on the farm, real work and real wages, and Thomas accepted with a handshake that felt like a commitment, which it proved to be. He boarded in town at first. Then, when it became clear the arrangement was permanent, he and Abel built a small two-room addition to the farm's secondary outbuilding, creating a simple but solid dwelling that Thomas moved into in the fall of 1887. It was Thomas who found the woman he would eventually marry, a dry-witted, sharp-eyed woman named Clara Hoskins, who was the same Clara Hoskins who had drawn the map of the Mississippi on a flour sack in Pearl's classroom in 1883, and who was now 20, fully grown, and working at her father's store with a competence that suggested she had ambitions larger than stocking shelves, which she did. Pearl's satisfaction at this development was not subtle. She had known Clara for 4 years and thought highly of her, and the fact that her brother had the good sense to find a woman of real quality she considered a family characteristic. Thomas and Clara married in the spring of 1888, and the Hoskins family and the Walden extended family were united in the way of prairie communities, where marriage and work and proximity weave people together into something more complex and more durable than any individual thread. Will was 3 by then, old enough to be a ring bearer at his uncle's wedding, a role he executed with tremendous seriousness, and a slight detour toward the flower arrangements that had to be redirected by his mother's hand on his shoulder at the critical moment. He was the kind of child who made Abel laugh every day, not because he was riotously funny, though he sometimes was, but because he was so entirely himself, so particular, that his presence in any situation was vivid and real in a way that made the situation more vivid and real by extension. In 1889, Pearl told Abel she was expecting again. She told him in the evening after supper when Will was in bed and the house was quiet with the good kind of quiet, the full kind, and Abel was reading by the fireplace. She sat down across from him and folded her hands in her lap and waited until he looked up. When he did, he saw the same expression she had worn 4 years before, that steady, watching look. He set his book down. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He put his hand out across the space between their chairs and she put her hand in his. "Are you glad?" she asked. "Pearl," he said, "I am always glad of anything that is you." She looked at him in the firelight, this woman who had arrived alone in October 1883 with a paper bag of provisions and a carefully made courage and had changed everything about what his life meant, and she said, That is the finest thing anyone has ever said to me. It is only the truth, he said. Their second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1889, and they named her Ruth Eleanor Walden. Ruth for Pearl's grandmother, Eleanor for no particular reason except that it sounded right with Ruth, and right with Walden and Pearl liked the shape of it. She arrived with considerably more ease than Will had, which Pearl attributed to experience and Abel attributed to the universe demonstrating belated mercy. Ruth was a different child than Will from the beginning, sunnier and louder, inclined to laughter in a way that could fill a room, with Abel's dark eyes and Pearl's quick mind, and a temperament that seemed to belong entirely to itself. The farm that Will moved through with serious attention was the farm Ruth moved through with delight. She was 3 years old and convinced that every chicken was a personal friend. She was 4 and attempting to ride the gentlest horse in the barn, a round old gelding named Copper, with a determination that none of the adults in her vicinity could bring themselves to entirely extinguish, because she was entirely adorable in her determination, even when she was also entirely dangerous. She was 5 and reading from Pearl's books, following her finger along the lines with the concentrated frown of someone engaged in a very important negotiation. Abel Walden, at 35, looked at his life and understood that he was the recipient of a kind of good fortune he had done nothing to deserve and everything to tend. He told Pearl this one evening in the fall of 1890, standing on the porch in the old habit, the prairie night all around them, and the stars doing their extravagant work above the ridge. Ruth was in bed. Will was reading in the main room. The farm was quiet in the way it was quiet in evenings, the satisfied quiet of a day completed, and Pearl was beside him with her shoulder against his arm as she had stood beside him on so many evenings now, wrapped in a shawl against the October cold. "I used to stand here," he said, "before you came and tell myself that this was enough, the land and the work and the seasons. I told myself that for years." She leaned into his side. "And now I understand what I was doing," he said. "I was not grateful for the land, I was hiding in it. There is a difference." She tilted her head back to look at him. "What changed it?" "You," he said. "And then Will and Ruth, and Thomas coming back, and Mrs. Greeley bringing the children up and down the main street of Harrow's Bend like a proud grandmother who has decided she is a proud grandmother and no one has anything to say about it." He paused. "All of it, but you first." She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark prairie, at the land that had been hers as much as his for 6 years now, that she had learned and worked and stood in and looked at with those eyes that turned even familiar things new. "I think," she said slowly, "that you were not hiding exactly. I think you had not yet been given a reason to know how much more there was." He thought about that. "That is kinder than the truth requires." "I am not being kind," she said. "I am being accurate. You are the most genuinely good man I have ever known, Abel Walden, and before I came you had been working very hard in the right direction without a clear destination. That is not weakness. That is just an incomplete map." He turned and looked at her profile, her face turned toward the dark land she had come to love, and he felt the wave of it, the same wave that had hit him the first time she smiled at him at the Christmas social in 1883, the comprehension that this person was real and present and his, and that these facts together constituted the most extraordinary gift he had ever been given. "I love you," he said. "I have not said it enough. I never say it enough." She turned to look at him. "You say it every day," she said. "Not always with words, but every day." He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and they stood on the porch looking at the prairie and the stars. And the house behind them held the warm light and the sound of Will turning pages. And somewhere in the night a coyote said something to the dark. And the creek was quiet and the grass was quiet, and the world was, for this moment, exactly what it should be. The following spring, 1891, Pearl organized the first library in Harrow's Bend. It was not a grand undertaking by any large city standard, 40 books donated from private homes, a corner of the church hall given over on Thursdays and Saturdays for lending, a handwritten catalog kept by Pearl herself in a logbook she bought with her own money. But it was the beginning of something, and the people of Harrow's Bend understood it as such. Within a year, the collection had grown to 90 books. Within 2 years, a small room was added to the schoolhouse specifically for it, and the county contributed funds, and the Harrow's Bend Public Library, such as it was, became a real institution, and Pearl was its founding custodian and its most vocal advocate. Abel watched her do this the way he watched her do everything, with the particular attention of a man who never gets tired of watching someone do something they are entirely suited for. He helped where he could, mostly in the physical labor of building the shelves and hauling donated books in the wagon, and being present at meetings with the county board, where a man's presence still sometimes greased wheels that a woman's presence alone did not reach. He was very clear with Pearl that he was a physical support in this enterprise, and that the enterprise itself was entirely hers, and she said, with the dry precision that still made him laugh after 7 years, that she had never been in any doubt about who was running the library. The years moved. The children grew. Will, at 7, and then 8, and then 9, showed a particular aptitude for mathematics that even Pearl, who was not unconfident in the subject, had to admit exceeded her own natural inclination. He was solving problems in Abel's farm ledgers at 9, not playing with numbers, actually solving, finding efficiencies that Abel, who was good with money but not mathematically inclined, had missed. Abel began to understand, watching his son, that the boy's future was probably not going to be this farm, and he spent some time with that understanding before arriving at the place where he could hold it without resistance. Ruth, at 4 and then 5 and then 6, was a force of nature in miniature. She had opinions about everything, expressed them loudly, and was not deterred by disagreement. She was Pearl's daughter in the quality of her thinking and Abel's daughter in the stubbornness of her position holding, which Pearl noted with what Abel suspected was quiet enjoyment. Ruth's relationship with the library began at age 4, when Pearl first started bringing her on library days, and by age 6, she was arranging books on shelves with a proprietary confidence that the adult patrons of the library found either charming or alarming depending on their temperament. Thomas and Clara had their first child in 1890, a boy they named Joseph, and their second in 1892, a girl they named Margaret, and the extended family of the Waldens and the Chandlers and the Hoskinses was by this point sufficiently woven into the fabric of Harrow's Bend that they were simply part of how the town understood itself. One of those family complexes that becomes a landmark of a community the way certain trees become landmarks of a landscape. In the summer of 1893, something happened that Abel had not anticipated. He was in the south field in the early evening, checking on the late summer condition of the pasture grass, and the light was that particular quality it had in August evenings, amber and long, casting everything into high relief, and he stopped walking for a moment because the grass was very gold and the sky was very blue and the air was very still, and the world was beautiful in a way that was, for a moment, almost too much to take in. He stood there in the middle of his field, a man of 39, and he looked at the land around him. The land his father had bought and he had inherited, and he had worked his whole life, and he understood something he had been circling for years. The land had not changed. It was still beautiful. He still loved it. But what he had been doing with his love for it, all those years before Pearl, was using it the way a person uses a wall. Not for what a wall is built for, not support, not the framework for something larger, but as an end in itself. He had been standing against it with his back pressed to it, and telling himself the wall was the whole of the house. When a house is the wall and the roof, and the light through the windows, and the fire in the grate and the voices of the people inside it. And without all of those things together, it is not a house at all, but simply a wall in a field. He walked back to the farmhouse in the August evening, and he could hear Pearl from outside, reading to Ruth in the main room, her voice carrying through the open window the way it did when she was engaged in something that gave her pleasure. He could hear Will at the table, the scratch of his pencil, working on something in the comfortable, absorbed silence of a child who knows exactly what he's doing. He could smell supper in the air, something with herbs from the kitchen garden and the faint sweet hay smell from the barn, and the creak at the edge of hearing, low in August. He went up the porch steps and he stood there for a moment before going in, the same porch where he had stood in the autumn of 1883 with cold coffee in his hand and a silence around him that had felt, though he hadn't understood it yet, like an accusation. The accusation was gone. What was here instead was everything the silence had been trying to tell him was missing. He pushed the door open, and Ruth saw him from the settee where she was curled against Pearl's side and said, "Papa, Mama is reading the one about the birds again." And Pearl looked up from the book with that smile, the full one, the one that changed her face, and Will said from the table without looking up from his work, "Father, I found a calculation error in last month's grain ledger. Do you want me to write out the correction?" Abel Walden stood in the doorway of his house in the August evening and he said, "Yes, son, and then wash up. Your mother made supper." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the quiet of the house was the full kind, the good kind, the kind that has people in it. They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in June of 1894, and Pearl organized it herself, because she was Pearl and organization was what she did. She arranged a supper at the farm, inviting Thomas and Clara and their children, the Hoskins family, Mrs. Greeley, who was 70 now and still brought geraniums to her windows and still kept a rifle under her front counter, Mrs. Aldrich, whose church socials were now a 15-year institution, and Dr. Ingram, who had delivered both Will and Ruth, and who had been treating the community of Harrow's Bend with steady competence since before Abel's father had died. Abel had a gift for Pearl that he had been planning for 6 months. He had commissioned, through Duval's telegraph connections to a craftsman in Wichita, a bookcase, a proper one, tall and with glass doors and good wood, made to a size that would fit the wall of their main room where Pearl's books currently lived in an arrangement that was organized but crowded. He had it delivered to the farm the morning of the anniversary supper and had Thomas help him carry it in and position it, and when Pearl came in from the kitchen and saw it standing where he had put it, she stopped in the doorway and put her hand over her mouth. "Abel," she said. "You need more room," he said simply. She walked to it and ran her hand along the glass door, the same way she had run her hand along the covers of those first books he'd brought her in November of 1883. Then she turned around and she walked to him, and she put her arms around him, there in the middle of the main room, and she held on in the way of someone who is not demonstrating affection so much as expressing it, completely and without reservation. "You remarkable man," she said, into his shoulder. "The books are remarkable," he said. "I just built the shelf." She pulled back and looked at him. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. She looked at him the way she had looked at the view from the ridge, taking it in, measuring it, finding it more than adequate. "I think we are very good at this," she said. "Better all the time," he said. The supper that evening was the kind of supper that happens when a community has grown into itself over years, when the jokes have backstory and the silence between sentences is comfortable, and the children move among the adults freely, and the food is good and the evening is warm. Will, who was 9 now, sat between Thomas and Abel and talked about mathematics with a seriousness that made the adults exchange looks of suppressed amusement. Ruth, who was 5, fell asleep on Mrs. Greeley's lap at 8:30, and Mrs. Greeley sat very still for the rest of the evening so as not to wake her. When the guests had gone and the children were in bed and the house was still, Abel and Pearl sat on the porch together in the June dark, side by side in the 2 chairs that had replaced the single one that had stood there in Abel's solitary years. The prairie was dark and vast and full of its nighttime sounds, crickets and nighthawks, and the distant low of cattle and the creek. "What do you want?" Pearl asked him, for the next 10 years. He thought about it with the honesty she always drew from him. "This," he said, "more of this, Watch will go wherever his mind takes him. Watch Ruth become whoever she is becoming. See Thomas and Clara's children grow up alongside ours. Work the land well and leave it better than I found it. Grow old with you." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a very good answer," she said. "What do you want?" he asked. "The library," she said. "I want to see the library become real. A proper building of its own, not a room in the schoolhouse. I want Harrow's Bend to have something that lasts after I am gone." She paused. "And I want to see my brother settled in his life and happy. I want to watch our children surprise us. I want to sit on this porch with you for every year we have and not take it for granted." "Do you?" he said. "Take it for granted?" "Never," she said without hesitation. "Not for a single day." She reached over and found his hand in the dark. "Do you?" He looked at the sky, at the stars above the ridge, at the land that was dark and full and his and also hers and also their children's and also part of something much larger than any deed could contain. "No," he said. "I used to be in danger of it before I understood what I had." She squeezed his hand. He held hers. "Abel," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for driving me up to the ridge that first Sunday." He smiled in the dark. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked if you wanted to go." The crickets went on and the stars went on and the land went on in all its enormous, indifferent, beautiful permanence. And on the porch of the farmhouse that had once been too quiet and was now just right, Abel Walden and Pearl Chandler Walden sat in the good dark and held hands and did not say anything else, because there was nothing left to say that was not already understood between them. Spoken in the language of 10 years of Fridays in Mrs. Flores's coffee establishment and Christmas socials and spring mornings, in the kitchen garden and summer evenings on the ridge and winter nights, by the fire and every ordinary day in between, which had proven, one by one, to be not ordinary at all. The library got its building in 1897. It took Pearl 3 years of county board meetings and letter campaigns and patient, relentless, practical argument to make it happen. And when the building was done, it was small but solid, brick-built with a good stove and 3 rooms of shelves, and a reading table by the window that caught the afternoon light. And Pearl stood in the doorway on the day it opened to the public and looked at it with the expression Abel associated with her finest moments. That look of something being confirmed that she had always quietly believed was possible. He was standing behind her, and he put his hands on her shoulders and looked at the room with her, and she put her hands over his, and Clara and Thomas were there, and Will and Ruth and Mrs. Greeley, who was 81 now and had walked the 3 blocks from her boarding house at a pace that defied all geriatric expectation, because she was not going to miss this, and Hoskins and his wife, and Dr. Ingram, and half of Harrow's Bend. Thomas Haymaker was there, the boy who had not been able to get through a recitation without stopping, who was now 21 and working at his father's feed store, and who could read anything put in front of him. He came up to Pearl at the opening and shook her hand with a formality that was clearly something he had prepared, and he said, "Mrs. Walden, I wanted you to know that I still remember what you told me, that the words would wait." Pearl looked at him with those eyes, the ones that missed nothing. "They always do, Thomas," she said, "for anyone who is patient enough." He nodded and stepped back, and Pearl watched him go, and Abel watched her watching him, and he understood that this, all of it, the school and the library and the children of Harrow's Bend who were better for having had her in front of them year after year, was as much his life's work as the fields and the cattle, because she was his, and he was hers, and what she built he had been part of even when his contribution was simply being the person she came home to. That evening, after the library opening, they drove home together as they had driven home so many times, the road they knew completely, every rise and dip of it, the place where the cottonwoods grew along the creek, and the place where the ridge became visible to the north, and the place where their own lane turned off the main road. The sun was going down in the west in a long stripe of gold and rose, and the grass was the color it always was in that particular light, the color he had tried to describe to her before he had ever spoken a real word to her, the color that gave the trees of Ohio fair competition. "Look at that," Pearl said as they came around the last bend and the light hit the grass of the home pasture. "I see it," he said. "You have been seeing it your whole life," she said, "and you still look at it." "It is worth looking at," he said. She turned and looked at him with that full smile, the one that changed her face, and she said, "So are you, Abel Walden." He reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat the way he had taken her hand crossing town on late November afternoons in the early days, and she laced her fingers through his the way she always did. And the horses knew the way, and the farmhouse was ahead of them with the lamp in the window that Will had lit because he was old enough now to remember to do that when his parents were coming home in the dark. And the land was all around them, the good land, the beautiful land. The land that had always been there and always would be, not as an escape from life, but as the ground beneath a life that was, by any honest measure, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.